bird has the longest and most extreme migration in the world. I'm talking about 9 days of nonstop flying without food, water, or rest. Or how about a bird that in its lifetime travels the equivalent of 3 round trips to the moon?
And while those birds are making insane journeys across the globe, some of their distant cousins are already arriving here in New England. Right now, in February even. Why is that? What is so urgent that they're flying into snow and freezing temperatures instead of waiting for spring? And if that's not enough, we've got a Grizz with hella Riz and a guest from 35,000 years ago. Trust me, you're going to want to hear these stories, so let's get into it.
So for this week, Dustin wanted to talk about the early bird migrations that happen in late winter here in New England, right? So that got me thinking, Dustin, in my mind, I think it's amazing the journey that some of our New England birds take twice a year. And it really got me wondering. I know there's a lot of birds that are going to pass through Massachusetts over the next couple of months, coming from the south. Some of them are even just making their way through here and heading up to Canada. And as impressive as those journeys are there migrations that are even longer than what we see with our local bird populations that pass through Massachusetts?
Oh, absolutely. There are some astounding migration patterns, both through New England in the Atlantic flyway, as well as in other flyways around the world. So first up, we have the Bar-tailed Godwit. Now, this is a bird that's known for having the longest nonstop migration of any bird. Now, this is really astounding because it breeds up in Alaska, even northern Alaska, and migrates down to New Zealand and eastern Australia. And it does this in a single trip, taking up to 9 days, no rest, no eating, no drinking, just straight flying for 9 days and up to 6,800 miles just in that trip alone. In order to do this, it accumulates significant fat reserves and can even reduce the size of its digestive organs to minimize the weight on its body. Because over 9 days, it's not really using anything except for its muscles, in its wings and its brain and its lungs. So all of the non-essential organs during that time actually shrink in size.
I kind of feel bad for every time I've whined about having to sit in a plane for a long time, flying from Boston to San Diego. And then there's this bird that's doing this, right?
Yep, absolutely. And we often think of birds as sort of just traveling north-south or along a specific, we can talk about flyways later, but along a specific route. But there's some birds that actually skip from continent to continent too. And so there's a bird called the northern wheatear, which shows up on the east coast of Massachusetts every once in a while. But this is a bird that kind of lives in northern Europe and jumps over to like northern Russia and Alaska and Canada, and sometimes comes the other way from Europe to Greenland, the east coast of the United States now and then, and across Canada back to Alaska. So they're really all over the place. They have a really interesting migration pattern too. Birds.
If it's moving from continent to continent, is it drastically having to change its food source? Or is a bug, for example?
Pretty much a bug is a bug. Those birds like kind of rocky coastal edges, so any kind of invertebrates and stuff along the way, whether it's in the sand or in the seaweed along a jetty, that sort of stuff is where you would see them.
Interesting. All right, what else do you got for us?
The red knot is a really interesting bird. There was one red knot that was documented to have lived at least 27 years, and over it doesn't have quite as long a migration journey as the bar-tailed Godwit. And these do pass through Massachusetts in the spring and kind of early in the fall or late summer when they're heading back south already. But the red knot that was discovered at that age was called the moonbird because it had flown the equivalent of 3.5 times back and forth to the moon just during its lifetime when you add up all of its migration journeys together. So that's a really good one.
How did they know it was 27 years old?
It was a bird that had been banded and recorded and then was recaptured, and the band was red, so they were able to track it that way.
That's awesome.
And then another one that's really interesting is an Arctic Tern. So this has the furthest migration of any bird. It's just nonstop like the Godwit was. But these birds will migrate anywhere from 11 to 50,000 miles from the high Arctic all the way down to the tip of South America. And over their time, they might travel 1.5 million miles. It's crazy.
That is crazy. That's amazing. Man, that's some frequent flyer miles.
Yep. But it also goes to highlight birds have, it's not just a migration strategy, it's a lifetime breeding and survival strategy about where is going to have the most food and give them the most success for breeding in that year. And, you might think a bird could, live in the Amazon forest year round, but something happens that makes them want to come northward into the US for their breeding. And we'll talk about it.
All right, this was really interesting. Are you ready to move on to our featured topic of the week?
Let's do it. So I wanted to talk about some early signs of migration for bird watchers. What are the indicators that migration is starting? So I was working at my desk the other day, and I had basically 2 or 3 things happen all at the same time that made me realize it's here. There's signs of spring. Spring isn't here, but the signs of spring are here. So the first is, what triggers birds to migrate? And this is the noticeable length of day. And we as humans tend to notice it as well. I don't know about you, but around 5 o'clock now, I no longer have to turn on my lamp because it's not getting dark. Or I finish up work and I'm sort of surprised that, there's a little bit of daylight left and I can do something with that. That's the first sign. And birds key off of it as well. They sense the length of day, and that triggers their instinct to start heading north, especially for certain species that are really sensitive to it. The second thing I noticed this week was that the American goldfinches are already changing color. In the fall and winter, they kind of fade into this drab, greenish brown kind of color, but especially the males start to turn yellow, and at this time of year, they're already making that transition, so they're kind of like splotchy yellow in some spots, which will gradually turn into their complete yellow coverage by, April-ish or May. And next is an increase or a change in the way that birds sound. So a lot of beginning birders or non-birders think birds make a single sound.
That's me.
Yeah. But in actuality, they have sounds for different things, right? They might have a contact call that's usually just a little chip, like chip, 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 which is just their way of announcing where they are to their partners or the other members of the flock, and they do it all the time to stay nearby one another. And then some birds have a territory call, like you think of a red-winged blackbird with its like chick, chick, chick,
yeah, really loud squawking is what it sounds like to me.
Which is a territory identifying call. But what I heard this week was chickadees, which all winter long are making their contact call to one another and doing a little bit of their alarm call, which is more of the typical you hear like chickadee dee dee dee, right? And by the way, that chickadee is sort of a mild alarm call, and the more dee 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 dees they put on the end is the bigger alarm. So if they just go chickadee dee, it's kind of warning the rest of the flock that something's around. And then if they see a hawk or something, they might go chickadee dee 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 dee. And if they see a human at the feeder, they might give you a whole bunch of D's because they're really like worked up about it for a second. But they didn't do that. I was working and I heard them actually making their call, which was sort of like a Peter, Peter. And that was the first I've heard their song since the late summer or so. So some of the birds are already starting to use their spring voice, so to speak, which was really fun to discover. And
why do they have a spring voice?
Well, they use that when it's approaching breeding time, so they can demarc their territory from others and also start to attract mates.
I see. So that's their romance language.
Yep, you got it.
Interesting. It's basically the equivalent of a bird being like, "Hey baby, what's your sign?"
A little bit. Or early on it might be more like stay away, or kind of all the here's my territory. This is my spot in the club.
Interesting. So from the time that you start hearing their little romance language starting, there's still a while to go before they're actually going to start coupling up for the season, right?
Yeah, and some birds couple up and stay together like essentially monogamously for multiple years. Like cardinals, I rarely see at the feeder except in their bonded pairs. So they might already be paired, but they start calling to sort of announce that they're ready to start breeding. They haven't started yet, but that's why they're not starting quite as early. They're already paired up.
That's sweet. I like that.
Yeah. So what should birders look for in February and March, right? We've got some visual cues. The first sightings of birds returning to areas, of course, when you see something you haven't seen in a long time, or you start seeing a lot more of a bird that you might have seen all winter, is one. Next is changes in flocking behavior. So some birds start gathering up in large flocks and then migrating together. And depending on where you are in the country, you might start to see much larger flocks of things like different blackbirds and stuff like that. And some early migrant raptors, like turkey vultures, start soaring overhead in groups. And they're early migrants as well, showing up in February.
Interesting.
Secondly, you've got some auditory cues, hearing birds for the first time in a while that you hadn't heard. Of course, even if you hear a bird, it means it's around. You don't have to see it to know that it's present. So you start to hear things like phoebes when they start showing up in late March or early April. And American woodcocks, for example, have a really notable, unique peent, peent sound. And so if you live, near a field or a forest edge, you might start hearing that in about mid-March, and then they get really ramped up around sunset in late March, early April, when they're heavy in their breeding behaviors.
Are we going to have to go to the field at nighttime again? That was the bird that you took me to the field last year, right? At nighttime.
Do you mean, are we going to get to go to the field?
And the
to
coyotes were like,
yeah.
And I started to get a little nervous, and it was really dark. I'll post the video as a short. It was actually really kind of funny.
Yeah, so we'd gone to a field just to observe the mating display behavior of woodcocks. And off in the distance, we heard a pack of coyotes that had found something and were howling and announcing and very excitedly digging into their meal, I think.
They did not sound off in the distance. They sounded like they were on the other side of the shrubs we were near, and it sounded like there were a lot of them. That's all I'm going to say on that. But
they were probably a quarter mile away.
Okay. Sure.
And then the third thing to look for is behavioral cues, right? We start to see that more aggressive territory claiming among those birds that return early, like red-winged blackbirds, and even robins fighting over space. So robins flock up more in the wintertime and hunt for berries collectively. But then they start to break up and you start to see smaller groups and individual robins. And of course, when you see them on the grass, a lot of New Englanders have sort of the old wives' tale in their head that robins only show up in the spring. But we have robins all winter long. Their behavior changes and you start to see them in smaller groups or individually on your grass instead of just in large groups going from neighborhood to neighborhood together. So that changes a lot.
So why are some birds, like you said, some of the birds don't really migrate, but some of that species will? Why do some birds, some of them stay up here and others are like, no? Is it the same reason some of our neighbors choose to migrate down to Florida in the winter and other ones of us are like, yeah, I'll just stay up here for winter?
A little bit. It's sort of hardwired into them, and for reasons that we don't fully understand, some birds just don't have that migratory instinct and they stay around, even though others of their species do have it, and they might be shorter term migrants and, of course, shorter distance migrants. And of course, some birds migrate from here and leave, but they get replaced by birds that maybe came down from Canada. So we see them all the time, and it's hard to know if they're the same birds that didn't migrate or if they just got replaced by further northern populations. But robins are one that both migrate and stick around, and sometimes food availability really dictates that as well. If you have a particularly cold or snow-covered winter, robins will migrate more, get down south where there's more food availability. But if you have one where there's a lot of ground available, like we haven't had much snow this year until right now, those are some cues that they'll do too. So they're opportunistic migrators that way.
That's a good point I hadn't considered either, is that just because I see a robin outside in winter, it doesn't mean it's a local one. It could be one down from Canada.
Yeah.
and our local guys could have taken off.
Yeah.
So that's interesting.
And then lastly, starting to see birds hang around nest boxes or known nest cavities is another sign that possibly that migratory birds are coming in and the local birds are protecting that territory, or birds that are migrating in early are coming in order to get that nest site advantage and be here first. So some birds, like an American kestrel, for example, will even overwinter sometimes specifically to protect a really good nest cavity. Or they might migrate back really early in order to claim it before the other kestrels. So they're a little bit more variable, but they're a fun one to keep an eye on too.
Do we know, like, do birds ever change their mind on what they consider to be home? So, for example, you've got some tree swallows that grew up in nests here in Massachusetts, right? And they migrated for a couple seasons down south in the winter and then came back up here. Do they ever decide that, like, oh, I don't really like Massachusetts anymore, so this migration, I'm going to go farther north than Massachusetts, or I'm not going to go as far as Massachusetts? Do they ever change their home base?
Yeah, some certainly do, and others are very strict about that decision. So it varies by species, and it varies by individuals or flocks within that species as well. But you're really talking about something called site fidelity and how dedicated they are to returning to the exact same spot. And tree swallows that you mentioned have a really high site fidelity. I'm not a bander. I haven't banded tree swallows, but there's some tree swallows that come back, I think, to our same nest boxes every year. And some of them come back and sort of immediately are on the nest boxes when claiming them right away, while others seem to be going through the competition and the selection process, which might be younger birds coming back for the first time, or birds that haven't nested on the specific box, but maybe from this territory. Others are less site specific, or they will wander when there's, this is where human development and climate change start to play a role, not just in the northward migration, but southward. So imagine, for example, that there's not a conservation land. Imagine there's a field that's not conserved that gets sold for development. Oftentimes, that development project might start in the fall, and while the birds are migrating away, but then they come back in the spring, and suddenly there's a bunch of house foundations, and the field is no longer there, and the nest cavities from dead trees and stuff are gone away. So in those cases, they sort of have no choice but to branch out and go to another location. And that's been really detrimental to certain birds like purple martins, for example. Now, we've seen these at Disney and along we went to Universal Orlando last fall, and we saw the white, big gourd-shaped houses along the canals where the ferry would run. Those are purple martins, which are highly, highly specific in their nest sites, and they basically only nest in existing colonies where they were raised to nest. And they actually had a really special relationship with the indigenous people of North America, who figured out that they could grow and keep gourds for purple martins to nest in as nest boxes. And purple martins actually got dependent on humans even in the pre-colonial era because of the indigenous people that did that as a practice. And so now there's not that many nest boxes for them. They don't use natural nest cavities. They don't use chimneys like chimney swifts. So they've suffered really strong declines. And there are some really good conservation programs where those known colonies are, but they're like, because they're so site specific, the impact of development is really crucial for them. And that's why you see even big developers like the Walt Disney Company putting purple martin gourds wherever they can in those known areas for their colonies.
I'm glad people care enough to do that for those birds.
Yeah.
Okay, so getting back to our New England birds, one thing I wonder is, you wanted to do this episode because of birds that you said are already starting to come back, which kind of surprises me a little bit because, I don't know, I guess for me, we just had a snowstorm last night. It's February, March. Why would birds choose to come back now and not wait?
So we often think of birds as these fragile little packages, and that's true to a large extent, but it doesn't mean they're incapable of surviving in cold and through snowy weather. They might have a hard time doing it for 4 or 5 months, but they can certainly do it for a month or two for a bird like a red-winged blackbird or whatever. So partly it's the strategy to get up here first for nesting in territory places, but also to get the really delicious bugs. So New England has a lot of bugs that sort of lay their eggs and are in the larval stage inside trees and stuff like that. And they're maturing and starting to emerge in early spring as soon as stuff starts to thaw out. So we mentioned the lengthening of day already, but the temperature average is already noticeably growing in February as well. We start to have longer days, more sunlight, more hours above freezing, and those delicious larvae start to come out. And the birds, they also don't just sort of, we talked about exceptional migration routes, but a lot of birds are more slow migrants. So red-winged blackbirds, for example, they're interesting because the males all come northward the second, third week of February is when they start. But the females hang back for a few weeks. And as they start to migrate forward, they're not just sort of going one shot all the way north. They're working their way northward, finding good bugs to eat in South Carolina and trying a little more northward and finding good bugs in Delaware and trying a little more northward and finding good bugs in New Jersey. And then maybe they get to Massachusetts and they're like, oh, the bugs haven't come yet. So now they stop and they wait for that stuff to emerge to get them when they're really fresh.
Well, then what are the girls going to eat when they get here?
Well, the males start establishing their territories, and then the females they start late, but they take a bit of a more direct route, and they arrive on the territories. And here's all these males announcing the great territories that are already established. And now the male starts to share his territory, and the female benefits from that territory definition that the males have already started.
Got it. Okay. So it's basically just a strategy for territory advantage then.
Mostly, yeah, and food availability and that kind of stuff.
That's wild to me. My perception has kind of always been, so we, as we've mentioned in some of our other vodcasts, live on a small lake outside of Boston. And for me, I love nature, but I have a very different experience of spring than Dustin has. He's a little bit more observant than I am in this area. And for me, it's like I wake up one morning and it's like Mother Nature flipped the switch overnight. And all of a sudden, all the ice has gone on the lake and all the wildlife has shown up. So what's wild is as soon as the ice on the lake thaws in the spring, all of a sudden we start seeing beavers around and there's muskrats around and there's more foxes running around in the neighborhood. It's like they're all preparing for their babies in the spring. And then boom, the birds are here. So it seems so sudden to me. I was surprised when you said that there were already birds that were starting to come back up at this point. So with that in mind, I'm curious. You've mentioned red-winged blackbirds, but what are some of the examples that you can give us of birds that are already making their way north to places like New England in February and March?
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned the ice actually, because that's another thing that northward birds, especially the waterfowl that are coming north, really are keyed into. Is some of them are kind of short distance migrants that might just go down to the mid-Atlantic where the lakes and rivers don't freeze very much at all, so there's open water all winter long. Some of them might go down more to Georgia and Florida where there's never any freezing. But then as they come northward, again, they're sort of flying north until they stop seeing as much open water, and then they hang out on some open water, and after a few more days maybe try more northward, and they might get to a place that's mostly frozen but there's a little swamp or something that they can hang out in while more starts to thaw. And we're having a really good ice season because we had a very cold January. The ice on our lake now is a foot thick, so we might not see those early waterfowl until later March or something this year. But turkey vultures are a good early migrant. People don't often think of turkey vultures as really even being migratory, perhaps. But when you go on a road trip now for all of February, keep your eye on the sky, because where you might have only been seeing red-tailed hawks and an occasional bald eagle, you start seeing turkey vultures again, because they do start showing up in the Northeast by the third week of February for sure.
I even read somewhere online when I was researching for our vodcast that some bald eagles even migrate.
They do. Some of them, especially in our area, we're kind of in the middle part of their range. So in our area, they often will just go to the rivers or the coast to find sort of open water, because they like to scavenge for dead fish and stuff like that, and steal fish from the other birds that are around. But some bald eagles are heavily migratory, and on the hawk watch that I went to last fall, we were seeing eagles sort of streaming southward. That was in September, which was some of the early bald eagles. They tend to be a little bit later of a migrant. I want to say, early November, but they do. Some of those populations do migrate quite a bit.
I love when we see them on the lake. Now that I think about it, we see a lot of activity of them on the lake more in the spring and the fall that I can recall than midsummer and stuff.
The highest is really when the lake is partially frozen. So mid-December is really good.
Yeah.
And March to April is really good. They also, there's a known nesting site nearby about a mile away. So we start to see them a little more when they've got chicks to feed. And so we do see them around, but they don't hang around our lake much. They might pass through in the morning, hunt once, maybe be back later in the day. So we see them regularly, but not frequently, is probably a good way to say that. The next early migrant's another hard one to kind of have the time exactly for, but Canada goose. Again, some of them are here all year round. I know they're your favorites, so we needed to include them.
I love them. I know some people think they're a nuisance, but I love them. I love when I can hear them on the lake having their little conversations with each other. I'm always convinced that those are the couples bossing each other around, but they're absolutely, and their babies are so fluffy and adorable in the spring. It's awesome.
Yeah.
I love them.
And although we have some winter populations, we start to notice them because we'll hear them especially early in the morning flying overhead during migration season. We mentioned robins as well. They do some migrate and some hang around, but you start to see them a lot more, and that behavioral change, matters. We mentioned the red-winged blackbirds, who are known February migrants showing up in big numbers. They're a fun photography target for me too. Early in my nature photography experience, I read about a photographer who had captured literally the notes of a red-winged blackbird as it called, because you could see its breath. And so as it called, you could see the three notes that had come out of its lungs, essentially, which is really cool. So every spring I try to spend a little time specifically photographing red-winged blackbirds that are backlit by the sun to try to get that. I've captured it fairly a few times, but never quite as good.
Do you think we could find the name of that photographer if we searched for it?
Yeah, I know the blog that it came from. It was someone who was referenced in Julie Zickafuss's blog, so I'll find it.
All right, we'll put it in the description for this video. I don't want to put the image in because I'm sure it's copyright protected,
Right.
but we'll put a link to where you can find that photographer in the description for this video.
And then next is a shorebird called the killdeer. I didn't realize this until we started researching it. Also, actually starts its migration journey northward because they're really widespread. Some of them just go down to Florida. Some of them go down to sort of northern South America. So the ones all the way down there are starting in January, and they start to show up here in late January, February time. So they're a fun bird to see kind of any time of year. They're striking looking. Speaking of waterfowl, the hooded mergansers and the ringneck ducks that I love to see on the lake, those almost always show up in March, sort of as soon as, I don't know how they know it, but as soon as the ice is out on the lake, they almost always show up the very next day. So I don't know if they're around kind of scoping the lake, waiting for the ice to melt, or if they're just always on the leading edge and kind of looking for the next, lake with open water, but they always show up as soon as the ice is gone.
You've got some photography too of one day in late winter, early spring, where not even all the ice was gone, and there was this huge congregation of multiple species of ducks and stuff that had all shown up at once. Well,
Yeah, it was a fun day. I remember that year. I'm pretty sure it was March 23rd. And what had happened is the ice had been gone off the lake for at least a week or two. And then we had a super cold, still night, and most of the lake refroze overnight. And all of the birds that already were here kind of gathered together to keep a spot open. And it was kind of near a dock, but they didn't want to leave that spot. So they were much more tolerant than usual of having myself and a couple other birders on the dock watching them. But we had buffleheads and hooded merganser and ringneck ducks and swans and mallards and wood ducks, and Canada geese. I'm sure I'm missing a few as well, but we had a really great mix. And so we'll put in some of those photos and videos. I have a lot of that content.
all right. Anything else that's going to show up that we haven't talked about?
No, but my favorite is when the tree swallows and the barn swallows arrive. And the tree swallows, they're not quite as early as everything else, but kind of in mid to late March, you have the chance of seeing them. I tend to see them in kind of early April, the ones that come and stay.
So this seems like that we are right up against an exciting time of year if you're a birder, right?
Yeah, and that's why I wanted to do this segment at this time of year so you can be in tune with what's happening in the migration pattern and know that it's already time to start looking. And a lot of people get joy from seeing the signs of spring.
Okay, so this is really interesting. I have a question though. Of course I do, right? How do you know all this? Like, where did you get all this information in your head from?
I, I've always been intrigued by biology, but I'm not a biologist or an ornithologist by trade. So when I got into birding about 10 years ago, I would get itchy in the off season. I love to read stuff in tune with what's happening at that time of the year. So I read baseball books in April when it's opening day time. And I like to read bird books during the winter time that correspond with the season. So in the past, I've talked about the book Winter World by Bert Heinrich. And there's a migration book by Scott Wiedensahl called A World on the Wing. And I love that. I love books like that because it gives me the chance to read about something while I'm itching to go do it. And so books like that and some speakers that I've seen over time that also have talked about bird migration. I saw one once at a local library who did a month by month presentation about migration patterns, almost solely to highlight that every single month of the year, some species are actively migrating. And then some birds have super interesting migration facts, like the way that they build up fat stores and stuff. So birds like the bar-tailed Godwit that we talked about, they somehow manage to actually build up their muscle mass without exercising.
I need that. So when we were researching the vodcast this morning, doing our like final little notes to add, I noticed you going on to a couple websites to verify and just confirm some of the information you had in your head about a few of the species that shows up, especially the killdeer. Um, how does the data that's on those websites get in there? Like, do we just have like ornithologists without even realizing it that are just running around at this time of year with clipboards looking for birds and when they show up? Like, how do we have all this data?
Yeah, well, we're in the age of big data, and birding hasn't escaped that, right? Now, in the modern era, the data has really blown up because we have all these citizen scientists that are contributing to seeing birds and putting them into eBird. So when I go out birding and I come home, because I don't love to use the app when I'm out, but some people love it, I like to get on eBird and check off the things I saw. But that data, when you aggregate it, starts to show where birds were in what concentrations at what time of year. All of that stuff adds up. And that's why the science inside of eBird and other citizen science projects is so important.
So what's the cost? Like, let's say you're a relatively new birder and you discover that there's such a thing as this eBird. I'm assuming it's an app that you put on your phone.
Yep. It's a website and an app.
How much does it cost for the app? Is it free?
It is a free app, so it's funded by the Cornell Lab of Ornithology and some other conservation organizations. Not only that, but you can sign up to different list serves, and eBird even has a feature that will email you daily or whenever certain species happen. So like mine, I'll go to a filter and land in a folder, but I can sort of tell it like, hey, send me a list every day of the birds in my county that I don't yet have for the year. And so in January, it's a big list because all the birds, I don't have any of them yet. But then when something new comes in, you can sort of click on it and go see what habitat, what sort of specific location it was in. And oftentimes the birders that see it or record it, particularly if it's notable, will have notes in there that might say like, hey, it's right near the parking area at this wildlife refuge. And, look at the ranger station and turn to the right. And there's a big stand of birch trees and it's in there, right? That kind of stuff. So it can really help people find a bird that they wanted. The other thing about digital birding is that it's really also married like nature and being outside with technology and people who like screens and apps and stuff like that. So there's a lot of young birders who are brought into birding as an outdoor activity because it also tickles the computer sided, the digital side of how they were raised.
I've seen you use it like every once in a while when we're out on a trail and you hear a bird call and you're not sure what it is. But I didn't realize it did all this other stuff as well. I thought it was just kind of a like dictionary of birds and their calls. So if you need help identifying something in the field, you don't have to carry a field guide with you.
Yeah, and modern radar is also really, really good. So we were looking at Birdcast earlier today, the Birdcast website. Radar is so good that, or as radar got better and better, there were like blooms of activity that at first people didn't understand what they were because it wasn't like a whole bunch of airplanes taking off or there was no storm in that area on a clear night. And they realized it was actually bird flocks coming up. So especially in the spring, if you go to Birdcast, you can see the daily migration report that literally shows the radar with blooms of birds working their way up. I always get jealous because the central flyway seems like all the early migrants are heavy in the central, like sort of the Mississippi flyway up the Mississippi River. And then the eastern flyway is sort of a week or 10 days later. But you can really start to see that stuff if you check into Birdcast every day at that time of year. It's really fun.
Cool. I have one more question about eBird, and then I think I'm done with digital birding. So, what if you're out on the trail and you don't have a mobile signal on your phone? Will it still work?
It does. So, the eBird app uses GPS to know where you are, and you tell it what you saw, so it knows kind of what time it was ticked. And then when you get back to a mobile signal, it'll sync the data up.
Okay.
Cool. Or like me, I prefer to just put it all into eBird later when I get home.
Yeah. All right. Anything else about our early bird migrants that you have to say before we close out this segment of the podcast for this week?
No, I think we hit it, but I'd love to see some comments from anybody when you see an early migrant or in a bird you're hoping to see. We'll be glad to give you some tips on when and where to look.
Yeah, and if there's a bird you particularly look forward to and are usually waiting to arrive because it's one of your favorites, add that in the comments as well.
All right.
All right. I think it's time to move on to our final segment of the vodcast for the week. Okay, so Dustin's very excited about this. Very excited. I heard you have a crazy discovery that you found in the news that you want to share with all of us that I think, when he told me what it was, is kind of ironic for a vodcast about birds. But what is it?
It's more on the predator side for sure. But recently there was a scientific paper written about a recent discovery from a couple years ago of a 35,000-year-old saber-tooth cat cub that was discovered in the permafrost in Siberia. So it's a
saber-tooth kitten.
It's definitely a saber-tooth kitten. But this was notable for a number of reasons, which is, although we've got lots of fossilized records of saber-tooth cats, this one was unique because it was one of the only kittens discovered. It appears that this kitten was probably 3 weeks old or so when it died. Even at that early age, it has a really big kind of muscular neck for a cat of that size. And that really seems to prove that these cats were built for taking down bigger prey and, feeding on stuff that was, potentially bigger than them, which is pretty interesting.
So it's a buff baby kitty.
Yep. It also was discovered like nearly perfectly preserved. So you can clearly see its features, the color of its fur, and there was, soft tissue that was available there too. So we literally have, you know, DNA essentially from.
Toe beans
That's right.
and whiskers.
That's right. It's pretty neat.
So yeah, so there's an article that we found on NPR that is up on the screen now if you're watching the vodcast. And yeah, there he is. I recommend you go online and take a look at the article. It has even more pictures from the paper. It's really fascinating. But moving on to our second nature news story of the week. So we've all heard of snakes on a plane, but what about bears on a copter? Or as Dustin likes to call it,
a grizz with hella riz.
So the last recorded sighting of a grizzly bear in the North Cascades National Park, so we're talking about Washington State, was in 1996. And grizzly bears are now being reintroduced to that area. They are being helicoptered in from places like Alaska, and they are going to start with an initial population of 25 bears over the next 5 to 10 years that are going to be introduced to this area. Basically, what they're trying to accomplish by doing this is just restoring the ecological balance to that area that no longer exists now that you have this apex predator that is not there. And they're trying to also rectify the population decline of those bears in that area, which did not take place by real, I don't know how else to put it, natural circumstances.
Yeah, we didn't plan to gradually squeeze out grizzly bears from that area.
Yeah.
Although we might have indiscriminately hunted them for reasons that were perfectly valid to, farmers and hunters of the time. But now starting to see what the disappearance of apex predators from a habitat can do, we start to see the flow down of those things and bringing something back the way that, for example, coyotes were reintroduced successfully into Yellowstone. And that really helped change and restore the ecology of a lot of the habitat there into more beneficial habitats for all the other animals down the food chain.
Exactly. If you want an ecosystem to be in balance, you need all the animals that were intended to be part of that ecosystem to actually be there. Now, I do want to acknowledge there are, of course, local residents in that area, including farmers and ranchers who have concerns because their livelihoods, they feel, could be negatively impacted by having these bears show up. However, 88% of the residents of Washington that have been surveyed on this decision agreed with bringing grizzly bears back to that area. And studies have indicated that grizzly bears that are introduced in similar habitats to this under similar circumstances, interestingly enough, do end up predominantly preferring a plant-based diet, which I never would have thought was the case. But from the articles that we've read, that is what those studies have shown. Now, the National Park Service is telling people in that part of Washington state the same thing that they tell all of us nature lovers that go into the outdoors, which is hikers, if you are in an area where you know there are known bear populations, you should probably carry bear spray on you. And most importantly, practice proper food storage techniques to make sure that you are not encouraging bears into your area by the delicious smells of the goodies and snacks that you're carrying on you. But I think it's interesting. I can you imagine having a grizzly bear on a helicopter with you? I mean, I know they're sedated, but still, like,
I don't know for sure. Maybe we can find a photo of this. I suspect they're dangling below in a cage that they can lower down and open the door and fly off. So it's also it's not just sort of an efficient way to transport the grizzly bear, but it's also a safe way to do it for the bear to land and have its door opened, and probably the helicopter flies off so that as the bear wakes up, there's no people around.
That bear's got to be terrified if it wakes up and it's like 10,000. I wouldn't like that. But I guess you also don't want to risk that if the sedation wears off, you've now got a fully awake and alert grizzly bear in the cabin with you either.
Right, and you don't want them habituated to people either, so there's that angle for sure.
So there we go. We got grizzly bears in helicopters and saber-toothed kittens for you this week.
Yeah, I'm definitely going to put the Northern Cascades National Park onto my bucket list. Looks like a great place to visit.
Yeah, I love the Northwest. It's probably my favorite part of the country that I visited. It's got everything. So, all right. So there you go. Nature news is wrapped up. What are our final reminders for the week? I've got a couple, but what's on your mind, Dustin?
Sure. Before we head off on our next adventure, we wanted to take a moment to remind you this week's live stream happens on Thursday at 8 p.m. Call it Bird Brains and Board Games. So join us for our weekly hangout if you have time, or look for it in our content on YouTube, where we have it recorded often for replay as well. We often do nature-themed games, wildlife and science trivia, and chat about birding, conservation, or anything on our to be read book pile, as well as any upcoming adventures we have.
Yeah, absolutely. And then I also wanted to remind you that our latest blog post on North American bird discoveries and how scientists are rewriting bird lists is available on our new Medium publication called Down the Rabbit Hole. So I post a blog article every week there, and it typically is a deeper dive into something I learned from Dustin for the week. You can also find our vodcast blog and the wildlife photography that Dustin does, which some of it you can see on the wall behind us, on our website, hikeandhearth.com. And Dustin, are you ready to close us out?
I am. So just a reminder to everybody to keep your eyes on the skies and your heart in the wild. See you next time.
Bye, everyone.